1.2 trillion. That's the amount of funding the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, was supposed to award through formula and competitive grants, cooperative agreements, direct loans, contracts, interagency agreements, direct federal spending, subsidies, direct financing, and other funding mechanisms from over 5 years, starting in fiscal year 2022, that's federal fiscal year 2022, and ending in federal fiscal year 2026. Of that total, $550 billion was dedicated to new investments for all modes of transportation, water, power and energy, environmental remediation, public lands, broadband, and resilience. But what happened to the grants? How many, if any, of the grants were paused, frozen, or canceled? How many funding opportunities will be released by the current administration? And how much of the funds will be redirected or reprogrammed toward projects that are more aligned with the current administration's policies? For several episodes, you've heard me, this is not your first time watching this particular podcast, you've heard me mention that I was supposed to record an episode on another topic, but, timelier news emerged. And so I had to change and pivot to cover, what was the, hot topic at the time. Well, this is that topic I've been talking about. I've been wanting to do an episode on the bipartisan infrastructure law for months. And now I'm so happy that I'm finally able to do that. So like many of the past episodes, I have, video snippets embedded in this episode. So yes, I am finally covering the bipartisan infrastructure law in this episode of Federal Grants Explained. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Federal Grants Explained podcast. Stick around. I'll be right back. Welcome back to another episode of Federal Grants Explained, a video series and now a podcast I created to explain what's happening in the world of federal grants under the current administration. If this is your first time, my name is Patrice Davis. I'm the host of the podcast. On this channel, my goal is to shed light on what's happening with federal grant funding under the current administration. I'm covering everything from grant cancellations, agency changes and shutdowns, how the federal workforce reduction has impacted how grants are announced, awarded, and monitored by federal officials, and new and relevant federal policy announced through executive orders and cabinet-level memos. And when possible, I'll also feature guests such as former federal employees, and I've already done that several episodes ago. Please check it out. It was one of the most eye-opening episodes that we've done. And of course, I'll also invite other federal grant consultants and federal grantees who want to share their stories. If this is a topic you find interesting and valuable, please subscribe so you know when the next episode is published. In addition to subscribing, please hit that notification bell if you're watching us on YouTube. And of course, share this video with others within your organization or professional association who you think will find this information helpful. We're now going to get back to the topic at hand. And of course, that is, again, the bipartisan infrastructure law. As I mentioned earlier, the official name of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It was signed into law by President Biden on November 15th, 2021, and it was described as the, quote, most comprehensive infrastructure law passed by Congress in decades. It received this name or this moniker because it focused on all major sectors of infrastructure instead of just one, sectors such as water or energy or broadband. I actually wrote and published a blog on the bipartisan infrastructure law, and it's, of course, currently now published on the grantsworks.com website. I published this in August of 2022. And I remember being really amazed as I was writing this thing at the breadth of industries that were going to be impacted and the number of job training and apprenticeship programs. And I remember feeling a little overwhelmed, but I was able to successfully process and summarize the widespread impact that the bipartisan infrastructure law, and we're going to start calling it the bill, right? And not to be confused with a bill that's moving through Congress, but the bill, BIL. But I remember being very, very surprised at the impact and just again the breadth of this particular law and its impact on jobs, on innovation, and environmental stewardship, environmental remediation, and so. But thankfully, I was able to summarize it. Wrote this blog again back in August of 2022. And I remember actually hosting several webinars about this as well. I do also want to point out that both of those webinars are available. One webinar was on the bipartisan infrastructure law by itself. And then I did another webinar several months later on both the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. That's another law that spurred billions also in funding, and it was again a dramatic increase in funding, primarily for climate-related projects and quite a few other areas as well. It's not just for climate and green energy and green technology and many of the things that law funded. There were other elements of the Inflation Reduction Act as well, and I do plan on doing an episode on that particular law as well. It's important for those of you who may not be aware that when I talk about the law, a lot of the times, of course, the law actually authorizes funding, and much of that funding is authorized in the form of grants or cooperative agreements or many of the other funding mechanisms you heard me describe earlier. So when you hear me talking about the law, Inflation Reduction Act or bipartisan infrastructure law, I'm speaking primarily, of course, in this context, in terms of the funding from that law. So while broad categories of investments such as transportation and energy are clear, projects that were slated to be funded actually included replacing lead service lines, bringing clean water to people's homes, repairing roads and bridges, and creating what they called, quote, good paying union jobs. So the bill or the bipartisan infrastructure law allocated funding for over 350 programs across more than a dozen federal departments and agencies, including the U.S. Departments of Agriculture, Defense, Energy, Homeland Security, Interior, Transportation, and others. As I mentioned earlier, funding was supposed to be and has been provided through formula and competitive grants, cooperative agreements, direct loans, contracts, interagency agreements, even direct federal spending, subsidies, direct financing, and other funding mechanisms. Again, not only did it authorize over $1 trillion, but the funds were then, of course, going to be awarded by multiple agencies across multiple sectors and in multiple as multiple federal funding mechanisms. And so, again, as you can see, it wasn't just the number or the sheer dollar that was tied to this funding. It was the way it was structured. And I actually think as I continue to describe it and all the things that were built to make this funding a reality, to make this funding actually hit the local governments and cities and counties around the country, you'll see how well thought out. I'm not sure how well it was implemented, but certainly they put really, really good systems in place, it seems. And so I'll continue so you can learn a little bit more about some of the things that were put in place to make sure that stakeholders knew what funding was in place and exactly how they could access that funding. So speaking of funding, here are multiple examples of the funding available for just two of the program areas. So I'm only going to give you two program areas. The first program area is transportation. So funding allocated for transportation projects was supposed to cover a wide range of projects, including bridges, carbon reduction, tribal transportation programs, and congestion relief. On the screen is a sample of projects that were funded, some were not funded, and in some instances they are currently being paused. You may remember that I actually released a video about some of the paused infrastructure projects, and I believe that was episode 11 of the podcast. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that, you can certainly go listen to that particular episode. So here are some of the transportation projects that were slated. How many of them were funded or canceled or frozen or paused? Unfortunately, it's very difficult to know. But let's go ahead and start with the ones that were slated to be funded. So there was the Roads, Bridges, and Major Projects program that was going to fund $400 billion over 5 years. The Bridge Investment Program, $12.2 billion over 4 years. The Puerto Rico Highway Program, $900,995,000 over 4 years. The Territorial Highway Program, $239,505,000 over 4 years. Disadvantaged Business Enterprises, $50 million until expended. On the Job Training Program, $50 million again until expended. And then, of course, the Public Transportation Technical Assistance and Workforce Development Program, $27,545,852 until expended. There was also the public transportation. They actually allocated $91.2 billion for public transportation projects, and they were going to be available across a number of periods of availability. So it wasn't just a clear $91.2 billion over 4 years or over 5 years. There were going to be variations in the periods of availability. And then $38 billion for safety programs, electric vehicles, buses, and ferries, $18.6 billion. And of course, they had also projected and allocated to fund one of the largest investments in passenger rail. Unfortunately, as I'm sure you're not surprised, many of these programs, I won't say most, but many of the programs have been paused and more than likely will be reprogrammed or already have been reprogrammed. So as I say those numbers, think about, the jobs involved. Think about the apprenticeships. Think about the on-the-job training. Think about the workforce development programs that were going to be funded. And maybe some have been funded. So very, very happy for the ones that did see the light of day. But I did want to at least list what was projected, what was actually allocated to be funded, just again, under the transportation program area. Now we're going to list some projects under the climate, energy, and the environment program area. So investments in climate, energy, and the environment were supposed to encompass programs such as clean energy and power, water, resilience, and environmental remediation. For example, investment in clean energy and power projects were close to $75 billion in grant, cooperative agreement, contract, and other funding mechanisms through the U.S. Departments of Agriculture, U.S. Department of Energy, U.S. Department of the Interior, and of course, U.S. Department of Homeland Security. There was a $55 billion investment in water infrastructure that was also authorized by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. That included funding for drinking water, wastewater, water reuse, water storage, lead pipe replacement, and the removal of dangerous contaminants. Weatherization Assistance Program, $3.5 billion, and actually one of our clients won a Weatherization Assistance Program grant from the U.S. Department of Energy. Other programs included battery manufacturing and recycling grants. $3 billion were allocated for that. Grants in energy efficiency and renewable energy improvements at public school facilities, $500 million dollars were allocated for that. I'm going to just continue listing some of the ones, and you should see them on the screen. Energy Auditor Training Grant Program, $40 million. Career Skills Training, $10 million. Water Infrastructure Improvements for the Nation, Small and Underserved Communities Emerging Contaminants Grant Program, $5 billion. Water Recycling, $1 billion. $3.5 billion in Superfund site cleanup. And of course, there are some others, and I'll just say this, they're not going to be on that list probably. $7.5 billion was even allocated for alternative fuel corridors and a national network of electric vehicle charging stations across the U.S. So I'm sure that now that you see these numbers on the screen, you understand why I've been wanting to do this episode, because it's really important. And I hope you spread this video wide and far for everyone to understand what projects are, had already been implemented from the bipartisan infrastructure law. How many of them, some of them, of course, again, have been paused. Some will be reprogrammed. And I'm happy to learn as I was preparing for this particular episode that some will still be released. The concern, of course, if you consider it a concern, maybe it's not a concern of yours, is that the funding will be released, but it would be made to be seen as if the funding and all of these projects, some of these infrastructure projects, were authorized under the current administration, when in fact what is being done is that they're actually releasing funding opportunities that were authorized by the bipartisan infrastructure law that, as you know, was signed in 2021 under the previous administration. So there are other major funding areas, surprisingly. Now you understand why I was so overwhelmed as I was reading everything that I found online about the bipartisan infrastructure law. And funny enough, quite a bit of it came from official government websites. So, I'll tell a little bit more about that. I do have some details about exactly where I was able to find this information. So other major funding areas included broadband, $65 billion, regional commission programs, $8,678 million. 0.4 million. I'll just say $8.7 billion. And then there were programs that were specifically for the U.S. Departments of Commerce, Agriculture, and Energy. And that included funding such as the Secure Rural Schools, Bioproduct Pilot Program, Marine Debris Program, and Manufacturing Leadership Program. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the U.S. Department of the Interior also had their specific programs that were allocated for their specific agencies. And those included the Low Income and Home Energy Assistance Program, or called, a grant program called LIHEAP. And again, one of our clients applied for LIHEAP funding, and they did not receive it, but I'm very familiar with the LIHEAP funding program. And then there's the U.S. Department of Transportation specific programs, including the Bureau of Transportation Statistics and Training and Education Program. They actually allocated $127.5 million for that. And EPA, of course, had, their own slate of specialty programs that were specific to their agency. And that was the funding to address Gulf hypoxia. That was $60 million allocated for that. I have no idea if that's happening or not. Solid waste management and recycling, $375 million was allocated for it. And of course, that $375 million includes $75 million in funding for the reduce, reuse, recycling, education, and outreach grants. I always just think about, again, just how that money was flowing into areas that really would have helped to move the U.S. to the forefront, maybe not the forefront, but certainly as a partner in environmental sustainability and environmental remediation, as I mentioned. And when you couple it with what was funded by the Inflation Reduction Act, it really was, groundbreaking in a lot of ways, these two grants together. This is where I'd like to tell you about exciting things happening at GrantsWorks. So for those of you who may not know, I am the CEO of GrantsWorks. GrantsWorks is a grant consulting firm based in Atlanta, Georgia. We specialize in helping our clients find, obtain, manage, and comply with federal and government grants, as well as private sector grants. By the time this episode airs, we would have already announced something really, really exciting called the Global Grant Collective. It's a new member learning program specifically for grant professionals here in the States and around the world. So what is the Global Grant Collective? The Global Grant Collective, or the GGC as we call it internally, is a hub for community, for upskilling, for shared intelligence and connection. What's different is that we're building the space for grant professionals around the world. Another difference is that the community is multi-directional. It isn't the organization sharing information to its members communicating across each other with GrantsWorks, of course. And we just want to make sure that we keep that sense of community within the space that we created for the Global Grant Collective. As a member, you'll have access to in-person and online certified training. So you will be able, of course, to meet some of your professional development goals through continuing education units. You will also get, of course, a global professional network and community, ready to use resources and opportunities to share your expertise. If you want to learn more, I left a link to the Global Grant Collective below, so you can definitely check that out. And of course, come and join us. Now back to the episode. The previous administration put in place a website called build.gov. It was created to help people navigate the breadth of the funding opportunities from this law. If you wanted to know what programs was supposed to be funded, agency was supposed to provide the funding, if the funding was to be offered as a grant, contract, or another funding mechanism, whether your company or organization qualified for certain funding opportunities, then you could check out build.gov. I went ahead and recorded a video of the archived website, so I'm going to go ahead and let you watch that now. So I was able to find the archived build.gov website that was in the National Archives. If you go to build.gov by itself, you won't find it. You have to go to bidenwhitehouse.archives.gov /build. So this is the Invested in America build.gov page. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I saw when it was first released and what I'm noticing in terms of minor differences now. So this, again, was giving you some more information about the build. Basically all of the infrastructure projects that were going to be funded by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, also known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So it says $568 billion announced for over 66,000 projects. I know that amount is different from what I mentioned earlier. This is the actual projects, and I'm sure there's some differences between the $973 billion that I mentioned at the top, and of course this $568 billion announced for 66,000 projects. Now, as I mentioned, so basically you could come and find out what projects were going to be funded. These are just some of them. So I just wanted to give you an idea of what was in the works. So quite a few projects, again, 66,000. And as I described earlier in the episode, I gave you some samples of some of those projects. So I wanted to make sure that you all could come and check this out if you'd like. Then I also mentioned the guidebook to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. This is where you can come and learn a little bit more about, exactly what they had in mind. It was very, very detailed. All the projects were broken down by the type of project: transportation, clean water. And so you can definitely dig into that. So again, it broke it down by roads, bridges, and major projects, passenger and freight rail, public transportation, airports, and federal. Again, this is just transportation. This is climate, energy, and the environment. This is where, quite a few projects came out of this. And of course, this is where you could do the program search. You typically were, here, it's still here. Awesome. So I'm so glad this is here. You could literally come in and search by, project. I'm going to go ahead and do a quick search by, let's say, job training, just to see what comes up while I'm recording. Nothing's coming up. I'm wondering if it's not active. But why don't I try water to see if that helps? Yes. So it looks like it did change. So the aquatic ecosystem restoration projects, continuing authorities program under flood control are. So I just wanted you all to see all of the water, the projects that were in place. I'm going to go back and try that job training because there was several on the job. There it is. So career skills training in clean energy and water, funded by the Department of Energy. $10 billion was planned. It was going to be awarded as a grant on the job training program for roads, bridges, and major projects, again, by the Department of Transportation. $50 billion was allocated for that. And it was, of course, going to be awarded as a competitive grant. So when you get a chance, guys, if you're interested, come and check out bidenwhitehouse.archives.gov /build, and then you can see just a ton of information. So there's also apprenticeship.gov. I'm going to go ahead and probably record a video about that as well, because they had apprenticeship programs were going to be rolled out on a massive scale. I'm not sure what happened with that, and that's why I'm recording this episode. I want to dig into what has changed, what did not change, what was funded, what was not funded. And so just wanted to make sure you guys saw build.gov, just in case you didn't know about it. So in addition to Bill.gov, the previous administration also created something called the Guidebook, and the actual official name was the Building a Better America, a guidebook to the bipartisan infrastructure law for state, local, tribal, and territorial governments and other partners. That was the full name of the guidebook. And they created it to be, quote, as transparent as possible. This guidebook was an amazing resource. And for people like me that like to see federal grants out, as yes, the regulations, and yes, as funding that our clients and other organizations use to do amazing work around the country, it was just also really great, mirror into or portal really into what the funding priorities were of the previous administration as relayed by the funding authorized by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. It was supposed to be used as a roadmap to the funding available, and of course, as a resource for stakeholders to know who to contact and how to get ready to rebuild. The guidebook consisted of 13 chapters to align with the programs by issue area. And I personally used it to find funding opportunities for clients and to create content for our webinars. The federal government's USA Jobs website was also, ready to, of course, recruit all the different positions that were needed within the federal government to make these programs a reality. There were many, many, many economists, contract specialists, statistician, project officer, environmental protection specialist, engineering, and other positions that were funded by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So the federal government actually needed these resources, these human resources. And so the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law made it possible for the government to onboard the expertise it needed. By fall 2023, the previous administration had actually hired more than 6,000 new federal roles to support the implementation of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So this is where I'll pick things up a bit to share more about the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law then and now. Let's go ahead and just finish summarizing the then, and then I'll jump right into the now. So as outlined in the law, each state, right, and what I'm doing here is explaining how it went from the law to the funding opportunities, and then to the ways that they were communicating to states and to local communities, how they were to, get prepared, some suggestions on how they needed to get prepared. In some instances, there weren't suggestions, there were actually requirements. So, for example, each state was required to name its state-based infrastructure coordinator. So each state was required to have this position. In early 2022, the White House Infrastructure Implementation Coordinator sent a letter to governors outlining recommendations to prepare for the funding, including the appointment of state-level infrastructure coordinators to manage the flow of funds to each state. City leaders were then also instructed to develop collaborations with tribal leaders, county officials, civil rights, and territorial leaders. County governments were then instructed that to meet eligibility requirements for formula-based funding, they needed to be able to get subawards from state governments through metropolitan planning organizations, or MPOs, or competitive grants directly from the U.S. Department of Transportation or state departments of transportation. Mayors were then advised to coordinate across their departments and with metropolitan planning organizations, again, MPOs, to prioritize their capital needs, develop a project pipeline, identify funding to target in the guidebook, ensure all transit, railway, road, highway, and bridge projects are part of their MPOs, transportation improvement plan, begin mapping sites for electric vehicle and other alternative fuel charging stations, inventory and map lead pipes, work with the state's broadband agency, and establish relationships with federal agencies' regional offices. Do you see how well coordinated this thing was meant to be? Again, I don't know how this was implemented on the ground. We saw the funding opportunities, and of course we would apply for them for our clients. We don't know how well this was actually implemented on the ground, how much of that activity is still underway, how much of that activity has been paused because some of the funding has been paused. And so it's just important to, again, again, I really wanted to explain all of these things and how information was shared from the federal government down all the way to the, various mayor's offices, and all of the things that these mayor's offices were required to inventory just to get ready for this funding, to prepare their organizations to either get the formula funding or to prepare to get the competitive funding. When I say formula funding, I mean a formula grant or more of a competitive grant, right? So I just want to make sure you guys were aware, just provide some clarity there. Another important element of the bipartisan infrastructure law is the set aside funding for disadvantaged communities. Many were applied for federal funding from a slate of federal agencies for the very, very first time. And I'm sure many of you are aware that the previous administration actually proposed to advance equity, racial justice, gender equality, and environmental justice to ensure every program is accessible for underserved communities by providing technical assistance and simplifying the federal funding process. So, all bill programs, bipartisan infrastructure law programs, just in case you all weren't aware, were subject to President Biden's Justice 40 initiative. And I do plan on describing that initiative for you guys, for those of you who are not aware. Now, one of the programs that I actually wrote an article on LinkedIn about was the Reconnecting Communities program. And that actually allocated $1 billion to the U.S. Department of Transportation to reconnect communities, divided, the quote here, I'll use the quotes, divided by transportation infrastructure, often nearly destroyed or cut in half by a highway. So for those of you who are not aware, there were quite a few highway projects back in the 50s and maybe even into the early 60s that cut directly through a lot of minority communities, literally splitting these communities in half. And some believe that though that actual physical, let's call it a physical interruption, an actual physical division really led to some economic disrepair, so to speak. And there's a lot that has been written about this, a lot of studies that have been done about this. And so this Reconnecting Communities program was created. One of the reasons it was created was to, address that, or sort of to reverse the impact caused by that. And I do have some updates, of course, on the Reconnecting Communities program. So before we move on to where the bipartisan infrastructure law is now, I do want to quickly describe the Justice 40 initiative. So according to an article from the Urban Institute, the Biden administration explicitly promoted infrastructure as a means to advance equity and environmental justice and to reverse previous federal approaches that, quote, disproportionately led to harm and underinvestment for low-income communities and communities of color. So much of that law, the bipartisan infrastructure law spending, was subject to something called the Justice 40 initiative. And it was basically based on an executive order that directed agencies to ensure that at least 40% of the benefits of certain infrastructure investments went to historically marginalized communities or those overburdened by environmental harms. So that is, a summary of the Justice 40 initiative. If you want to learn more, you can certainly find the archived executive order that's online. So, certainly go and read that. I remember reading that myself. And then, so certainly I recommend if you want to learn more, just go ahead and find the archived website. So now that I laid out all of the things that the bipartisan infrastructure law was, what is the status of many of these funded programs? So the first thing that I'm sure you're already aware of, and this shouldn't be a surprise, the current administration revoked Justice 40 when it first came into office. That's one of the first executive orders that were released. Also, several of the alternative energy implementation and expansion projects were canceled. If you watched or listened to episode 12, of course, this is episode 13, I featured two employees from Capital Good Fund. And Capital Good Fund was the recipient of a $156 million Solar for All grant from the EPA, one of the programs that were to be funded by the bipartisan infrastructure law. All of the multi-million-dollar Solar for All projects have been canceled. And these were projects all over the country and even in the Virgin Islands. There were, these were programs that were funded to coordinate a significant expansion of solar energy for, communities for, we'll call them historically underinvested communities. And so it would have really helped them address some of the energy costs that many of them are now facing since energy costs have actually gone up. So just wanted to make sure that you all were aware that, yes, Solar for All is just one of the programs that is no more. It's kaput. If you want to watch that episode, I've included a link to it below. And what about the Reconnecting Communities funding? I found in a Transportation for America article from the middle of last year, the middle of 2025, that up to $3.1 billion or 97% remained unobligated and are now in the sights for elimination. However, of course, I can't go based on an article. I do work in federal grant compliance, and details are, of course, part of the work that I do. So I had to dig a little bit deeper to find a more accurate update on where things are. And what I found wasn't absolutely detailed, but it didn't really give me the full picture. So let me tell you what I found. I checked the government's database of funding, and I saw that there were 24 Reconnecting Communities grants awarded. Some had project periods, meaning there was a start date, an actual start date, and an actual end date. Several did not. And I found that very interesting. I have, so that gives me some insight into where things are. Yes, so 24 grants awarded. Some had project periods. The ones that did showed project start dates effective as of October 2024, so before the last election, to early January 2025, before the current administration came into office. So I do see that some grantees are utilizing their funding, and more than a few had $0 in outlay. So again, that tells me, it doesn't tell me much other than the fact that they received maybe a $10 million or $40 million grant, but $0 in outlays. And if it was awarded in, late 2024, early 2025, if there's $0 in outlays, it makes me want to question exactly where things are with that award, and where things are with Reconnecting Communities. That Transportation for America article may really sum up where things are, in that quite a few of those dollars remained unobligated and are potentially still in the sites for elimination. So according to a November 12, 2025 article, though, published by the Urban Institute, so I wanted to take some time to record a video of this article by Transportation for America. I realize they are probably, I don't know that much about them. I haven't had a chance to read about them. I'm assuming they're some kind of lobbying firm. Obviously, they're a special interest organization. But their article, grants are under attack on two fronts. Congress should stand up to USDOT, U.S. Department of Transportation, and assert its power over the purse. So the reason, though, that I wanted to show you guys this particular article isn't necessarily for some of the reasons that they featured the article for or created the article for. I really wanted to take some time to look at some of the projects that were awarded and expiring, and then some that were announced and awarded, and those that were unobligated and quote unapproved, expiring fiscal year 2022 grants at risk. I have not researched to find out how many of these grants were actually awarded. Were they terminated or frozen or canceled? I don't know. But I did want to but look at the Reconnecting Communities pilot program. So $185 billion was budgeted, 45 were announced / awarded grants, 5 were unobligated and unapproved fiscal year 2022 grants that were apparently at risk. And not just that, but some of the other ones as well. The Promoting Resilient Operations for Transformative, Efficient, and Cost Saving Transportation. Just wanted you all to see, again, just the wide range of grants that were funded and what were, and what was actually awarded and announced. And then where things stand for those that were actually obligated in fiscal year 2022. I also, this is one of the things about the bipartisan infrastructure law, and then just all the projects that were going to be funded. It's you almost have to do a program by program search to find out exactly where things are, because things have been canceled, grants have been canceled, grants have been were awarded. What happened to the rest? Were they renewed for the remainder of the you know project period? I'm unsure. But as I mentioned before, USDOT is also directly canceling grants that don't align with their new priorities. There are also funds that have been reprogrammed or proposed to be reprogrammed. I realize this doesn't really leave as much clarity as I would like, but because there have been so many moving parts with this funding, it's been more challenging than I thought, really. I would love to have been able to just find a list of all of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act or bipartisan infrastructure law grants, and have a status on each one. Was it reprogrammed? Was it canceled? Are they ongoing? Many of them are, as I said, are actually being released, but they're being released as I'll note, as if they're coming from the Trump administration, without giving credit to the fact that, the law that authorized this funding was actually signed by the Biden administration. So I did want to make sure you guys were aware. I'm going to have a link to this article as well, so you can check that out. But hopefully this is helpful. So, considering the policy differences between the previous and current administrations, it shouldn't come to as a surprise that funds intended for some programs under the Biden administration have been reprogrammed or proposed for reprogramming by this current administration. And I'm going to give you several examples that I found online. Where these things stand right now, I have no idea. But this list I did find from an article that was published in the latter part of 2025. So a little over $1 billion of unobligated funds from the Regional Direct Air Capture Hub program that was under the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. That's a sub-office or a division, so to speak, in the U.S. Department of Energy. Those billions are now under the new Office of Critical Minerals and Energy Innovation, a new office within the U.S. Department of Energy. There was $1.5 billion in unobligated funds from the Carbon Dioxide Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Program, plus another $900 million in unobligated Office of Nuclear Energy funds that has been reallocated now to nuclear energy only, apparently, for the Advanced Nuclear Reactor Demonstrations Program. Then there was $92.35 million of unobligated funds from the Regional Clean Hydrogen Hubs program, which is the H2 Hubs program, to nuclear energy. And then another $92.35 million in unobligated funds from, again, the H2 Hubs to fossil energy. And that's now under the Hydrocarbons and Geothermal Energy Office. And then, of course, $75 million of unobligated funds from H2 Hubs again to grid deployment, now primarily under the Office of Electricity, for programming to enhance the domestic supply chain for grid components. Again, if you go back and listen to episode 11, I did speak about some of these projects, specifically that hydrogen project, and how billions of dollars in hydrogen projects were paused. Many of those projects were in what are called Democratic-led states, and of course, some of the fallout from that. So this, of course, connects to that episode. So I hope you have a chance to listen to it. And of course, I'll include a link below so that you can easily grab that. Now, I do have some good news. Some bipartisan infrastructure law funds are on track to be awarded as grants and contracts through the end of this fiscal year, this federal fiscal year 2026. So here are some live, on the street funding opportunities that have been announced. They cover things such as carbon capture, brownfield assessment, cleanup, and multipurpose grants, intercity passenger rail, which is awesome, groundwater storage projects, lead service line replacement, and rare earth demonstration and critical mineral studies. So again, these funding opportunities are live on the street with deadlines in this month, January 2026 or February 2026. Again, as I said before, it's been very interesting that the current Transportation Secretary, Sean Duffy, did release a press release announcing some of these very same grants that were itemized and identified and funds were allocated under the previous administration, and basically describing them as part of the Trump administration's investment in modernizing America's transit bus infrastructure. So it's important to know that these funds are out there, and we're all happy that the funds are out there and that they're going to be awarded as grants and contracts and different funding mechanisms. But it's really important to know that many of them did, of course, come from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And, I have to say that it's that blurring of the lines. So the credit is not given to the previous administration is something that we should be just aware of. And I want us to all, of course, be aware of where this waterfall of funding actually originated and also who will take credit. So that's the end of this episode of Federal Grants Explained. If you want to learn more, resources I used to create this episode can be found in the description below. I have quite a few links down there. If you found this episode valuable, please do 4 things. I'm asking you to please click that like button, subscribe, share it with your friends and colleagues, especially those that work in some of the industries that we mentioned in this episode. And of course, add a comment. Your comments really do help, get the conversation going. I can learn from you. Maybe there are some things that I misrepresented. So please use that as an opportunity to clarify something for me. If you're listening on a streaming platform, please give us a 5-star rating. If there's a particular topic you'd like me to cover or something you'd like to add that I didn't cover, again, something maybe I misreported or misrepresented, please drop it in the comments because I am open to and I do read your comments. GrantsWorks, as I mentioned, is a grant consulting and training firm based in Atlanta, Georgia that supports our clients as they find, obtain, manage, and comply with federal and other government grants as well as grants from foundations and corporations. We train your teams to manage their grants, help you identify compliance gaps, monitor and modify award budgets. We set up financial management systems. We develop required written policies and procedures and become audit ready. You can learn more about me and about GrantsWorks in the details below. Also, check out the links in the description to learn about GrantsWorks Academy, including the Federal Grant IQ training series. And so that's a 3-module, video-based, highly rated, and certified training that helps you better understand federal grants, how they're awarded, about some of the systems used by federal grantees, and about grantees' audit, reporting, record retention, monitoring, and their budgetary responsibilities. By the way, I'm excited to announce that Train in Federal Grant IQ training series now is certified to offer continuing education units by NASBA. That's the National Association for the State Boards of Accountancy. So if you're an accountant or you work in finance and you are a member of NASBA and you get get CEUs from NASBA, you can now take the Federal Grant IQ training series and get 6.5 CEUs towards your professional development. Of course, it's also certified by Certified Fundraising Executive for 4 to 6 education units, and of course by the Grant Professional Certification Institute for 4 education points as well. Again, my name is Patrice Davis. Thanks for watching or listening to this newest episode of Federal Grants Explained. Until the next episode, goodbye.